Well, we are now starting the roundtable. Let me introduce myself first. I'm Xavier Labandeira. I'm director of FSR Climate, and it's a pleasure for us in FSR Climate to welcome you here in Florence. And I wanted to start thanking the EA, Hans and Johannes, who was really a key person for, as you all know, for the organization and for the setting of this forum. We are very satisfied with the final program and looking forward to the interesting contents that we'll have in the next couple of days. Well, let me start saying that for us, you know, what we were listening here this morning is especially interesting because you know, both what Artur was saying actually is part of our work. You know, just to try to assess from an economics point of view and to give rigorous answers to many of the questions that were given by Artur, and not only through our own work, but also as serving as a hub of researchers and serving as a place where researchers and policymakers and other stakeholders in European climate policies can meet. We actually had 4 months ago, a big event here on the 10th anniversary of the UETS, where I mean we celebrated in a way the instrument with the presence of the people who made it possible from different areas, policy making, you know, consultancies, academics, etc. So for us, it's very interesting what we are listening to, and definitely it will help us a lot. And then we are now embarked, because this was part of our, you know, reason of being created, into supporting policy making at a European level. So what Gerben-Jan was telling was especially useful and especially interesting for us. So that's what I wanted to start saying. Well, the title of this roundtable is kind of taking a stock of evaluation of climate policies, right? I mean, and taking as a departure, you know, the first assessment report of the IPCC. So the idea in this session is just to debate about you know, how we are at the moment, and you know, what are the challenges, what are the missing things, what things can be improved, etc. in this area. I had the honor to participate as a lead author in the last assessment report of the IPCC in Group 3, and particularly in Chapter 15, which is on national and subnational climate policies. And we were especially interested in the literature on assessment of implemented policies at national and subnational level. And what we found is that, of course, there are many more policies being implemented in the world. And also we have some knowledge and some research done on this, and that we could report, but there are gaps, there are many things still to be done. So I would say that this roundtable is also very important for this forum, because I mean it can be as a kind of seen as a kind of framework for the next sessions later today and tomorrow, and I think that we are in front of a dream roundtable, right? I mean, we have you know, a very interesting set of people here. Two of them you already know, and we have the executive director of the European Environmental Agency, Hans, over there, and we have Juha Uitto, who is in the Global Environment Facility, and he's director of the Independent Evaluation Office. I will introduce them more later, but I think this is a dream roundtable to discuss these issues, and we are very happy to host it here. So I could say that we have a lot of inspiring ideas, as I told you before, from the keynotes before, and I'm sure that many of you have questions and have comments on them, and definitely this is the time to raise some of them later. But before that, I would like to proceed the following way. I will introduce first Juha and then Hans. I will give a few minutes to each of them just to do a short presentation. I understand that Artur and Gerben-Jan have already had their time. So basically, after these two presentations, I will raise some issues that may interest us, and then we will have cross interventions, and of course I will open this to the public. We have more than 1 hour, and I think that we'll have time for fruitful debate. So let me start with Juha. Juha Uitto, who is there. He's the director of the Global Environment Facility Independent Evaluation Office since September 2014, and previously he served as deputy director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the United Nations Development Program. He's a doctor, and he's published also on these topics. He has a book evaluating environment in international development. So for us it's a real pleasure to have you here, Juha, and I think that you perfectly fit the interests of this forum and with your experience in this area. So the floor is yours. Around 5 minutes, please.
Thanks very much, Xavier. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time in this European network meeting, and although I've been to some of the earlier meetings of the Environmental Evaluators Network in the States. Yeah, so I'm from the Global Environment Facility, and it's probably useful to say a couple of words about what the facility is before getting into anything else. It was established in connection with the 1992 Rio Earth Summit, basically to help developing countries to meet their obligations to the new environmental conventions, and to provide grant funding that is on top of the regular national development goals of each of these countries. So we are an official financial mechanism for the UN Climate Change Convention, but not only that, but also the Biodiversity Convention, the Land Degradation Convention, the Montreal Protocol, which although they have a different, and we have actually withdrawn from it already now, declaring victory. The Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants, and the Minamata Convention on mercury. So we have about half a dozen of these conventions that we are a financial mechanism to. Climate change, though, is a very important area for us, and about 1/3 of the GEF funding over the years since the Rio conference have gone to climate change. And it's about in the range of $7 billion that we have provided direct funding for developing countries in climate change arena, and raised about $30 billion in co-financing from the countries themselves, most importantly, but from other partners such as the World Bank and so forth. So I'm the head of the Independent Evaluation Office, which is, although we are an internal evaluation office, we are also independent in the sense that I don't report to the management of GEF. I report to the governing council, which is basically the countries that fund the GEF. So I have the mandate for providing for the accountability of the funds used, but also then an important mandate looking at organizational performance and performance improvement and lessons learned on how you can do things better, basically. We have done a number of evaluations on climate change area. For example, we did quite recently an evaluation that looked into the impact of GEF mitigation activities, and looking in particular to market change in 4 large countries, China, India, Mexico, and Russia. And that portfolio that we had basically stood for about 6 billion tons of CO2 equivalent per year emissions avoided due to GEF funding. But the evaluation also found that the indirect impacts of this work was probably about 10 times larger than the direct impact of the projects in these countries. Which brings me really to the question of what are we evaluating, and this is actually very closely linked to what the keynote speakers were talking about this morning earlier. So if we take, I mean, obviously the funders of GEF are very much interested in how many tons of carbon emissions are avoided by GEF activities. But I would argue that that's a very simplistic measure. Because the projects are there, they are often pilot projects, they are often demonstration projects and so on, and the direct carbon emissions avoided based on those projects themselves are, I would say, outputs. They are not the impact of the GEF work. The GEF basically works through helping countries to develop implementation strategies, providing them knowledge and information and access to networks, new technologies, developing institutional capacity and so on. And so the goal is basically to develop, to make the conditions for broader adoption and behavioral change in these countries. So how do you do that? So you look into obviously policies, strategies, regulation, standards, energy efficiency standards, for example, knowledge and technology, and eventually market change. How do you change the market so that countries can move towards low carbon economies? So we would argue that it's more important to evaluate how well have we dealt with these kind of conditions for a future market transformation rather than the direct impact of the projects. And that's what we are looking at often. We are looking at in our evaluations into what has happened and why and how and under what conditions. What have been the market barriers for not moving into low carbon development, for example? Maybe I'll stop here and we'll continue the discussion then.
Thanks, Juha. Well, let me introduce now to our 4th panelist, Heinz Bruyninckx. As I told you before, he's the executive director of the EEA since June 2013, and before that, I mean, he was in the academic world. He was head of the political science department of Catholic University Leuven, and also he was head of a research institute there, dealing with this topic, with these different topics related to research in the areas of environmental politics, climate change, and sustainable development. So, Hans, the floor is yours.
Okay, Xavier, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here also in a sort of personal history, because I first went to the EEN meeting as Juha did in the US, I think about 10 years ago, and then 4 years ago, the first European meeting took place in the institute that I was heading at Leuven, and now I'm in a different role, and yet we are here again. So this seems to be sticking in some way to what it is we are doing. From an EEA perspective, I think there is a clear link with our core task. The core task of the EEA is to provide timely, targeted, reliable, and relevant knowledge to European policy makers on environment and climate. And that means, in first instance, the European level institutions, the Commission. We work together intensely with DG Klima and DG ENV, but also with a number of other DGs. We work with the Parliament, with the ENVI committee in particular, and with the Council. But we also have a very strong network with our member countries. And I say member countries, not member states, because we have the 28 of the EU, and in addition to that, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Turkey. And we work with the 6 West Balkan countries. So the work which we do pretty much covers the European continent. And when you say bringing information to policymakers, it's quite obvious that evaluative type of information is part of that. And we have a history there. Many of you might know that at the turn of the century, the European Environment Agency was very active when it came to conceptualizing and thinking about methodologies, in particular about policy effectiveness. A couple of big reports were produced on methods and how to go about evaluating EU-level policies. I think there was a period then that we did it less explicitly, but in our newest multi-annual work program, we frame the knowledge needs that we want to respond to very clearly in terms of policy implementation and also in terms of long-term transitions. And we think that both of them are served with solid policy implementation. And so one of the policy evaluation. And so some of the reflections which we are making are based on the following fundamental reasoning. We've developed 4 decades of environmental policies, and we've developed a very good knowledge base. But if we look forward to the agenda of better regulation, better implementation, more impact on society, at the one hand, which is closely linked to the acquis, and where do we stand, and on the other hand, at this long-term agenda, we need to reflect on whether the knowledge that we have developed in the first 4 decades is the type of knowledge that we will need to make the steps forward in the next 4 decades, because we're looking towards 2030 and 2050. And so we do think that evaluation also is one of these elements that requires renewed attention for these reasons. We have done that by embedding it very clearly and explicitly in our work program. We have set up in the agency what we call a matrix task group that runs across the different programs in the agency that is working on 4 key topics in evaluation. One is methodologies, and that has already produced a first internal document that gives guidance to our staff on these issues. Secondly, the effectiveness question, which is obviously a crucial question also when you are talking about better regulation and fitness checks and that whole sort of agenda that is highly relevant politically in Brussels now. We are also reflecting on what is the role of policy evaluation in more systemic long-term change, the link with the transitional perspective. What sort of ex-ante, ad interim and ex-post evaluations can you do there? Because this might require rather different and innovative methodologies. And then we also, as you know, every 5 years write our seminal report, The State and Outlook of the Environment, which is based on a methodology of integrated assessment. And to what extent is an integrated assessment part of, I would say, an evaluation approach, and how can we improve on that? So there is a very deliberate approach in the house. We have tasked people to follow this up. We have a budget line associated with it. We will be setting up internally a system of strengthening people and training, working with the outside community, which is many of you present here, we hope. And to finalize the short introduction, we are also in a structured way working with Klima and with DG Environment now to reflect on what are their knowledge needs in terms of policy evaluation. I think Artur was very explicit about a number of them. We're doing the same thing with DG Environment, and we are trying to be efficient there because there is contracting and procurement from that side. We also do contracting and procurement to get support there. If we better understand each other, we can have a stronger joint approach to what policy evaluation can bring in terms of innovation and needed knowledge to European policy processes. Final note here, we are well aware that we can't do this on our own. So one strategic area in our multi-annual work program is what we call the co-creation of knowledge. So that's why we are reaching out to knowledge communities to co-design and co-create methodologies and knowledge around these issues. That's one thing. And the second thing is that we want to do this also together with our network of country representatives. This should not be just a purely European level affair because much of the implementation and the actual effects are at the level of member states and below. So we want to use our strong network with the member countries, IONET we call it, also in this exercise. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of where we stand and how we are trying to integrate this type of work in our work program. Thank you.
Thanks, Hans. So let me now, this will be a kind of, I will give you, of course, the possibility of raising different issues and questions, but let me try to set a few questions, or at least a couple of general questions for this roundtable. And I would like to start asking about to the panel about their views from their different perspectives on the problems or pitfalls of climate policy evaluation in the last few years or now, and with a view not only of criticizing this or just acknowledging this, but also with a view of learning from them and being able to improve in the future. So perhaps we can start with you, Juha.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I think that there's been, to put it simply, there's been too much emphasis on monitoring actual greenhouse gases and too little emphasis on the mechanisms that help countries to move into low carbon policies. And much of the problem is, of course, that we are talking about emissions avoided, which is a bit of a hypothetical question, of course. And I saw this earlier slide from Artur, I think, about which was about what would have happened if the regulations had not been in place. The counterfactual. The counterfactual is a difficult thing to actually to establish, but of course we can work on hypothetical things like that, and we have to. That is very important. In our case, for example, the GEF Council, the governing body of the organization, which consists of member countries, of course wants to know these things. But I think that there's a big difference between monitoring and evaluation, although the words roll out of our mouths very easily because we've been for 30 years, we've been talking about monitoring and evaluation, M&E as a pair. But monitoring is one thing. You have to monitor the indicators and so on, but evaluation is the more rigorous exercise in that sense that you will be able to understand better what works under what conditions, what doesn't work, for whom, and so forth. Interestingly, for example, we've been developing, I mean, all the evaluators, you're all evaluators here more or less, so we always talk about the theory of change. What is the theory of change for this intervention, and how is it expected to lead to the expected outcomes? We've developed a methodology that we call the theory of no change, which is basically looking at why things did not happen. What were the barriers to countries adopting some great scheme that we had come up with, for example. And you can use that for evaluation, but you can use it actually for program and project and strategy preparation when you have identified the large areas that need to happen for policy change to take place. And then you can actually identify critical areas that may or may not be happening, and that will allow you to develop better projects and better programs and strategies. I think it's very important that evaluators actually think in broader terms about the mechanisms and what is happening in the real world regarding how policies actually influence market and how policies influence behavioral change, basically.
What's your view on this and perhaps on the gaps of knowledge,
yes,
on the support of climate policy evaluation?
On gaps and pitfalls, I would like to build a little bit on what Juha called the theory of no change. I think we have probably not focused enough on lock-in mechanisms. What is locking us into no change? Why are things not moving in a certain direction? And this can be at the level of policies, but also at a more systemic level. The lock-ins might not be in the environmental policy. They might be in the financial system. They might be in the tax system. They might be in the structure of the market. They might be in other places. If we don't understand the lock-ins better, and this is also part of a policy evaluation, I think we are missing part of the analysis. I also think by understanding these mechanisms better, we can also reflect on potential mechanisms for positive lock-in. How can we use some of these mechanisms to make sure that what we put on the rails has a better chance of actually delivering what it is we want? That's then an ex-ante approach to a positive lock-in. So that would be one comment. The other one is, you said we have been focusing on actual emissions that are reduced or not reduced, and the counterfactualing and all of that. When we talk about climate change, I also think we increasingly understand that we will need to focus partially at least on adaptation. Yeah? Because there is a lot happening there. There is also money committed there. There are all sorts of policy processes taking place, but the focus of evaluation has clearly not been on that part, and that is even younger than the 10 years that Artur has referred to, but I think it's increasingly a field where we need to understand what is happening. A third comment I would make is that since policy evaluation is often driven by, I would say, contract money, we need to reflect on the blind eye that is also creating, or the things that we do not look at because they are not funded through contracts or in work programs or other things. And the scope of the environment policies by now is so broad, or of the climate policies, that I'm not saying that we should shoot at everything that moves, but we should at least reflect carefully on, are there important things in this broadening field that we are not looking at because maybe it's not what was on the calendar of the policymaker or on the calendar of the big research programs. I think this is probably a critical reflection that is more for the academic community than for somebody representing an institution of the EU system. But I think that's another point. And then obviously, I think we all know that when you evaluate policies, that you are very welcome in the room if you can say, yes, we're reaching results and we're well on the way, or at least, you know, we're making progress there, mixed results. But when the results are not good, yeah, and I'm not suggesting here that is necessarily the case, but it becomes a lot more tricky, because yes, you will be attacked sometimes on your methodologies, you will be attacked on preferences that you may or may not have, on the network that you worked with. So I think navigating as an evaluator, and I've been on the other side, I've been doing a lot of contract research with evaluation. So the position of the evaluator, I think, is something that also requires reflection. And we all know that in the climate field, there are a number of holy cows out there that if you evaluate them, you step on, you know, sensitive terrain. This is increasingly also connected and intertwined with the energy field. The energy field is a politically sensitive terrain because of huge investments, because of the political constellation around the energy field. I mean, this is sensitive terrain. So as an evaluator, I think these are things that probably as a field we should take into account, because let's put it this way, I think the worst form of censorship is self-censorship. Yeah? And I have to say I'm not suffering from that in my current role in the institution. Artur, don't see this as any form of criticism, not at all. But I think this is a field where there are a lot of minds out there, and as a community of evaluators, I think we should be rather upfront about where we see important work to be done, even though it's not immediately the highest priority on somebody's agenda. Yeah, I would leave it at that.
Thanks, Hans. A lot of inspiring comments for the subsequent debate. I would ask Gerben-Jan his views on this now.
I think the biggest problem is that work in this field is not front-page news. We have to be realistic. There is a very dominant agenda in Europe, and that's the agenda of jobs and growth. And it's so dominant that it's sort of pushing away everything else. If some policy does not create jobs or growth, then it's hardly considered to be any justifiable policy. In the same area, if you look at what people are concerned about, according to Eurostat, which is always doing research on this, only 5% of the European people are so much concerned about environment and climate that they're willing to change their voting behavior based on that. But 5% is so limited, that's not the majority that we need. If you look at the political guidelines that Commission President Juncker presented last year, there's nothing about environment or climate whatsoever. I do believe it talks about low carbon economy, but that's more, well, the current way of saying than that there's really a political guideline behind it. There's one thing in his guidelines on renewable energy, but I'm afraid that's more inspired by Vladimir Putin than by the climate. So that as a given, I think that we should try to find a much higher economic relevance in our story. also in evaluation. What is the economic relevance of the policies that we're developing in the field of climate? I strongly believe that there is a huge perspective in this. I often say tomorrow's company is either sustainable or it simply doesn't exist anymore, which means that any company should, if it's interested in its own future, should become sustainable. But we need data for that. You need economic proof that it makes economic sense to be producing in a much more sustainable way. And that's why I very much like, for instance, a report that was commissioned by the World Resource Institute, the New Climate Economy it was called. It was focusing on the perspectives of a very, very low carbon economy and investments in low carbon technology. We have to face it that if we move towards a real low carbon economy, that we need very disruptive policies, and that is something that in general politicians do not really like, because the electorate per definition is conservative. People hate these kind of changes, and the more they hate changes is disruptive changes, and that is something that we need in order to move towards this low carbon economy. So therefore we need the real data, the right information on how we can do this all in an economic sensible way, that it's not limiting the damage in an economic way, no, that it's even creating more growth and jobs than when we do not do it. And that's quite a challenge for evaluators, but it's, I think, one of the problems that we're facing, that we're simply not matching with the dominant European agenda.
Artur, what's your perspective as a policymaker?
I think I have very little to add to this. I think the main pitfall of climate policy evaluation is that there's too little of it. And kind of 5 years ago, I would not have blamed any evaluator, because every evaluator would have come and said, well, hang on, you only have 1 year or 2 years of data. How am I going to do an evaluation on this? But I think the situation is now different. If we take 2005 as a starting point, we are in 2015, which means we have now 8 years of solid data in place. That means more can be done. So I would hope that there is more uptake on real good analysis, because the database is there, and we have a very detailed database. And not only that, we have very interesting, we have very different approaches. Take, for instance, the renewables policies. Is all member states do it in one way or the other? So there is a big variability which can be exploited with the good methods you are having to say, look, what is the right way of going to go about a renewables policy in Europe? There's so many different ways. Some have used green certificates, others have dealt with feed-in tariffs at very different levels in very different ways. Some have let the state try to do the financing. Others said, no, let's the consumer do it. So it's such a very interesting file where you can kind of try to explore these experiences. And it's really for the purpose of creating some predictability and certainty for those who are suffering from those policies. And I think the renewables field is one of those interesting fields where, yes, we need this disruptive policies, but at a certain point of time, these policies got disrupted themselves, and that disrupted, again, the financial markets in Europe and upset the whole concept that was there. So we went through, I think, quite a turmoil, and we are not yet out of that on the renewable side. And to give advice, for instance, on that side, okay, what is a good way forward for policy making? Disruptive, but not as disruptive that it's going to destroy itself. I think that is, for instance, one of those questions that is very important. And that's the same for energy efficiency. Kind of, how can you take this forward in the coming years in a way that there's predictable signs, that signals you are giving to the investors, to the people who need to put their money onto those policies. That's the important thing. So a lot of challenges for the evaluators.
Okay.